So here we have Oswald atypically late, atypically with J.D. Tippit, uh, just before he's picked up by Ralph Leon Yates. I think that's quite an extraordinary convergence of details here, and the lone nutters don't like this because Oswald is supposed to be at work, but this is extremely credible. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Oswald was in the Dobbs restaurant with J.D. Tippit at a time when he should have been already at work. And this is just before he gets a ride to the Texas School Book Depository from Ralph Leon Yates. Now, looking at the map here, you see it towards the top. I've got the star with DP. That means Dealey Plaza. Underneath that in red is 1026 North Beckley Avenue, where Oswald was living. The Dobbs house is essentially in that same location. And underneath that in blue, I've got Beckley Entrance 1, and further down, Beckley Entrance 2. Yates said he picked up Oswald near the Beckley entrance to the highway. I don't know which one it was, but either one it was is significantly south of where Oswald is seen to be eating his breakfast at 10 a.m. It seems to me very unlikely that he would walk south when he's trying to hitch a ride north to Dealey Plaza. If he's going to walk any direction, he'd walk north, and he probably wouldn't even go to the highway unless the intent was to get a ride from a particular person. Whether that person knew it or not, I don't know, but I think the intent is to get a ride from Ralph Leon Yates. And also, it should be noted that he's not said to have had this big package at the Dobbs house. If he'd been carrying his curtain rods, I think Dowling would have mentioned that. But J.D. Tippit is in there. J.D. Tippit has a police car, and if J.D. Tippit wants to have curtain rods in the back seat of the police car, he could have them there. So I think probably we've got something going on here with J.D. Tippit and Lee Harvey Oswald and with Ralph Leon Yates. I don't want to say exactly what I think it is yet, because maybe I don't know, but I think this is a setup going on here. I think, and maybe not everybody knows exactly who's being set up, but I think that probably J.D. Tippit left shortly after Oswald did and gave him a ride to the highway, to the place where he was picked up by Ralph Leon Yates. And now comes the Oswald sighting that changed everything for me regarding my view of Ralph Leon Yates. This is the Mary Lawrence sighting at the B&B restaurant. On December 3rd, she got a threatening phone call, and she called the FBI. At 1 p.m., December 3rd, 1963, Mary Lawrence, head waitress, B&B restaurant, Oaklawn Avenue in Dallas, telephonically advised Special Agent J. Doyle Williams she had received an anonymous call from a male caller about 6 a.m. on December 3rd, 1963, who stated, "If you don't want to die, you better get out of town." Lawrence stated she has known Jack Ruby for the past 8 years, and that she saw him at approximately midnight on November 22, 1963, after the president had been shot, or during the early morning hours of November 23, 1963. Now, it's made clear by a subsequent statement that she means the early morning hours of November 22nd, not 23rd. That is, it's actually before the assassination, but here it's recorded as being after the assassination. Ruby was at the B&B restaurant at that time and was with an individual possibly identical with Lee Harvey Oswald. And if it was Oswald, of course it would have to be before the 22nd, or before the assassination. Lawrence was upset because of the call she had received and stated she felt The call may have resulted possibly because of her acquaintance with Jack Ruby. She stated she knew of no reason why a person should want to kill her, because her acquaintance with Ruby had been on a business basis, based upon her employment as a waitress at various restaurants in Dallas. Lawrence stated her husband is Charlie Lawrence, who is employed by Yellow Transit Company in Dallas, and that she lives with her husband, yada, yada, yada. So, Mary Lawrence thinks she saw Lee Harvey Oswald with Jack Ruby in the wee hours of the 22nd. And she gives a more comprehensive statement to the FBI on December 6th. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at approximately 1:30 a.m., a young man described as white, in his 20s, 5'7" to 5'9", medium build, 140 pounds, dark hair, came into the restaurant and sat down at a table, and when approached, stated he was waiting for Mr. Ruby, who would be in a few minutes. About 2:15 or 2:30 a.m., November 22nd, 1963, Jack Ruby came into the B&B restaurant, and after looking at the young man at the table, sat down at a table behind the cash register. He did not order his usual food, stating he didn't feel good, and ordered a large glass of orange juice. A few minutes later, the young man who was seated at the table went over to Ruby's table. Thereafter, Ruby paid the bill for both himself and the young man who had eaten. Mrs. Lawrence had never seen this young man in the restaurant before, nor had she ever seen him with Jack Ruby prior to this occasion. On November 22nd, 1963, after the assassination of President Kennedy and after the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald, Mrs. Lawrence saw Oswald on television and stated the photograph of Oswald on television appeared very similar to the young man who was with Jack Ruby in the B&B restaurant earlier on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. Subsequently, Mrs. Lawrence and Bobby, the cashier on the night shift at the B&B restaurant, discussed the young man who was with Ruby on the morning of the 22nd, 1963, and they agreed that he appeared very similar to Lee Oswald. Mrs. Lawrence was shown a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald, and she stated the young man who was with Jack Ruby in the B&B restaurant on the early morning of November 22nd, 1963, was similar in description and appearance to Lee Harvey Oswald. She recalled, however, that the young man she had seen in the B&B restaurant had a small scar near his mouth, either on the right or left side. Mrs. Lawrence advised she has no knowledge of activities of Jack Ruby other than her acquaintance with him as a customer at the B&B restaurant. She is not acquainted with Lee Harvey Oswald and had never seen him to her knowledge, unless he could have been the man who was with Ruby on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. So she says this guy looks similar to Lee Harvey Oswald. But according to the official story, this couldn't be Lee Harvey Oswald because he was back in Irving with Marina. He spent the night in Irving, and this is in downtown Dallas, so that couldn't be Oswald. Now, this is an undated FBI document. It doesn't say who wrote it either. But anyway, it attempts to explain this sighting away. In connection with the information furnished by Mary Lawrence on December 5, 1963, it should be noted that Curtis Laverne Crawford, when interviewed at Bel Air, Michigan on November 28, 1963, advised that he was the individual who was with Jack Ruby at the B&B Cafe at approximately 3:45 a.m. on November 21, 1963. Crawford pointed out that when he met Ruby at the B&B Cafe, Ruby was accompanied by a girl named Gloria. Well, there's two problems with this. One, 3:45 a.m. on November 21st, if that's what they really mean, is the night before. And also, Mary Lawrence didn't mention that the young man was with a girl. And if he had been, she probably would have mentioned that. And third, although I don't think she was asked, Mary Lawrence probably is familiar with Crawford too, because Crawford is a Ruby person. so presumably she had seen him before. Nonetheless, this seems to have spawned a lot of thought about Crawford being an Oswald look-alike. Well, this is Crawford here. Doesn't look like Oswald to me. I mean, he's kind of a young man, I suppose. Maybe he's the same height and weight. But you could mistake him from Oswald if you didn't know him or Oswald, and then, later you're remembering something. I suppose it's possible. But what I find most important about Mary Lawrence's description of this Oswald look-alike is the scar on his face. In the earlier statement I showed you, it said she didn't know which side of the face it was on. This is a January 30th interview she conducted with the Dallas police. And that might explain why this document is a little more revealing. She had been talking to the FBI before, and the other stuff I cited. And the FBI was familiar with Ralph Leon Yates, and probably more familiar with the details of the investigation at that time than were the Dallas police, or the policeman doing this interview anyway. Here she says which side it's on. Subject stated that on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at approximately 2:15 a.m., a white male, 5 feet 7 inches tall, 140 pounds, with dark hair, entered the Lucas B&B Cafe, located at 3520 Oak Lawn, where subject is a waitress. Subject stated that this man was positively Lee Harvey Oswald. Subject said this man stated that he was waiting for Jack Ruby. Subject stated that Jack Ruby entered the cafe a short time later, but did not sit in the booth with the man. The man believed to be Oswald went over and sat with Jack Ruby. Subject stated that Ruby and the man believed to be Oswald left at approximately 2:45 a.m. At this point in the interview, the subject stated that she could not be sure that this man was Oswald, but if he had a small, deep scar on his left cheek, it was him. I just saw yesterday Bugliosi addressed this, and he tried to sell us on Crawford here having that scar. Well, on his right cheek, it looks like he might have a zit right near his mouth, but I don't think you would call that a scar. It may technically be a scar, but that's not something you'd call a scar. A scar is something that is going to have a little length to it more than the width of it. That's like a zit there. I don't think she's talking about Crawford. But there is somebody in our story who has a scar on his left cheek, and his name is Ralph Leon Yates. When he meant to make his December 10th statement, the FBI made out a description of him for their report, and without that description, there would be no way of knowing that Ralph Leon Yates had a scar on his left cheek. A 2-inch burn scar running from left corner of mouth upward on left cheek. So Ralph Leon Yates, the guy who sometimes thinks his writer mentioned Jack Ruby, sometimes thinks he didn't, claimed didn't know Ruby, on the night of the next day after he gave Oswald a ride, he had a meeting with Jack Ruby.